Hi, welcome to episode 62 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Claire Bishop. Claire lives about 1,100 miles to the west of me in the Kansas City, Missouri area, where she is the executive director and chief operating officer of American Square, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit dedicated to enhancing the tone and quality of public discourse in our country. Claire, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you so much for having me today. I am doing well and excited to be joining you for this podcast on this nice morning in Kansas City.
Yeah, it's nice here as well, and I appreciate you kind of, I guess, indulging me in the random emails that I was sending you to have this conversation. But I really think, to me, it's been so gratifying to try to make those new connections in any new part of the country, because I feel like almost in every incident, in every case, people are eager to have conversations.
Absolutely. And we are craving that. And as a society, it seems we really are in desperate need of more and better conversations amongst and between ourselves. So that's squarely what we focus on at American Public Square. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about that if our conversation heads in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess then first, I guess one of the things that has kind of grounds me in a firm belief that in some respect, the conflicts that we have on opinion and issues is really rooted in the fact that I think our country is so, we lose sight of the fact that our country is so vast and so big and so dynamic, and there's just so many different levels of which it's changing, because it's not just distances, it's not just geography, it's not just different ethnic makeups or different business areas, but it's also different histories. Like when I talk to I live in New York City. New York City was has had people settled here, I guess European people settled here for 400 plus years. But if the further you go out west, you can be in areas which were just really settled maybe just a couple generations ago, and I think from that flows an extra level of difference that most other parts of the world don't have. Like if you're in Europe, you can be in different towns and there's differences between them, but those different towns don't necessarily have one place that's got thousands of years of history and then another one that's only got 50 years of history. Like Las Vegas doesn't pop up in Europe, but Las Vegas does happen in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Well,
with that, yeah, so go on.
oh no, I was just going to say it's so true and an astute observation. It reminds me of a great book that I read by an author named Colin Woodward, who wrote American Nations, I think was the name of the book. I've got it over here somewhere, but he talks about the immigration patterns and the tapestry sort of that's been woven in America that you can see when you sort of overlay the political map and see how people are voting and feeling about different issues. You can kind of draw that back to these patterns of immigration and the enclaves and the pockets that have developed and the cultures that sort of drove the different movements across the country. So that was a really fascinating book that gave a lot. I'm a huge history buff. I love to read about history and learn about history. I think you probably do as well, given the
Yep.
line of work that you're in. And so, if you haven't read Colin Woodward, I'd definitely recommend it. You're probably familiar with his work.
I'm glad that we're recording this conversation so I don't have to scribble it down. I'm going to add it to my book list.
Yeah, totally. Podcast notes. That's great.
Yeah. So I guess, can you, I guess, illuminate for those of us who have never been to Kansas City, it's such a trite, question, but can you tell me a little bit about what life is like in Kansas City?
Absolutely. Kansas City is a sort of a blue enclave in the midst of a couple of red states. We're actually right on the border of Kansas and Missouri. So I appreciated the fact that you opened the podcast by talking about the fact that I'm based in Kansas City, Missouri, because Kansas City. Although there is a Kansas City, Kansas, the bulk of the Kansas City that most people know is in Missouri and is on the state line. So we have suburbs that are in Kansas and we have suburbs that are in Missouri. Both states are, if we're talking politically speaking, are the state legislatures are predominantly red, and then cities like Kansas City are kind of popping up as blue cities in the midst of that. So Kansas City has population of around, I don't know, 500,000 or so, a million in the greater metropolitan area, if you count all those sort of surrounding suburbs and cities. Mayor Quentin Lucas is our mayor. He's a Democrat, and we have a pretty diverse population, particularly in the Kansas City metro. A reasonably high population of Black or African American residents, as well as Hispanic. And we also have certain portions of the city, like Northeast Kansas City, which is really diverse. And a lot of our immigrant and refugee support organizations operate there. So we have extensive populations of Somalis, Africans, of Afghan refugees as well. So there's a pretty diverse sort of tapestry within Kansas City. I grew up here, born and raised in Kansas City. My parents are coastal. Well, my mother's from upstate New York. My dad's from here in the Bible Belt, but they met in San Diego and relocated here to Kansas City. It's known as the Bible Belt, but I think that there are probably misconceptions from folks who live in coastal areas that consider Kansas City and parts of the Midwest really as flyover country with little to offer. Kansas City really truly has a thriving culinary scene, an arts community, a really extensive arts community, independent local crafts and makers that are well supported by residents of our city. We have an outstanding museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. We have a contemporary art museum, lots of fabulous restaurants, parks, green spaces, theaters, symphony, music, just a pretty vibrant cultural landscape here. And that's something that I think a lot of people who haven't had a chance to visit may not know. But I think one thing that everybody knows is that Kansas City is the king of barbecue cities. So yes, in fact, we do also have a lot of barbecue and a lot of good barbecue.
Is there a historical reason why Kansas City is known for barbecue?
I'm not sure if there is. I think it just has to do with sort of the migratory patterns, and the African American community is well entrenched in the development of Kansas City based barbecue. And in fact, there's a Kansas City family, the Gates family, that has the most probably widely recognized barbecue franchise, and they. There's some really wonderful reporting actually from our local NPR affiliate, KCUR, on the topic of the history of Kansas City foods and food culture. In fact, they produce a podcast called Hungry for Mo. It's kind of hard to say that because it's a play on words like MO, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
But then I don't know if I want to say for Mo, because that doesn't seem right. I got to get the articulation correct. But the podcast is called Hungry for Mo, and they have some stories, including history on barbecue, but also something that was new that was fascinating to me. Are you familiar with White Castle?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you all have White
Yeah.
Castles
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
that you can actually go through and drive through? Okay, we don't have those here
Yeah.
anymore. We used to.
Uh-huh.
They started actually in Wichita, Kansas, which
Oh
is
wow.
not far from Kansas City, and they were the originator of the kind of fast food hamburger in our country. So
Oh wow.
they did a podcast on that, which was illuminating for me because I didn't know anything about them. But I count myself as a fan of the White Castle burger too.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of them, but I've been to it, and I don't know. I mean, I'm in New York City, so there's not really many drive-throughs, but I've seen White Castle for sure.
Have you
Um,
ever? You haven't ever had them?
No, no, I've had it. Yeah,
Oh,
but
you have, yeah.
not there aren't a lot in New York City. But I grew up in the suburbs, so yeah, I've
Got to
definitely
have
crossed
seen them
paths with White
around.
Castle. Yeah, for sure. Um, is there a difference between the Kansas City portion of Missouri and the St. Louis portion? Can you tell the difference between like Eastern Missouri and Western Missouri people?
Yeah, it's kind of like the difference. So I lived in Florida for a number of years. My husband and I actually moved there out of college, and he had been in San Diego for many years and came back to Kansas City, and we decided to relocate to Florida on the southwest coast. And in Florida, it's interesting because people who gravitate toward the southwest coast, like Naples, Fort Myers, Bradenton, Sarasota, Tampa Bay, come generally speaking from the Midwest, and people who retire to or relocate to the east coast of Florida come from usually the eastern seaboard of the United States. So they're more the New York and the New Jerseys. Um, Similar, I think, to kind of just the sensibilities and the attitudes of people in St. Louis versus Kansas City. St. Louis feels a little more hardened. It feels probably more like the kind of personality that you're accustomed to running into in New York. Not just the type of person who's going to smile for no reason on the street. You know, what's wrong with that guy? In Kansas City, you know, in the particularly in the suburbs and the enclaves surrounding the city, you're going to find people who are, you know, a lot more have that Midwestern open-heartedness, you know, friendliness, uh, strong work ethic. Not that folks in St. Louis don't have that, but you've got your typical kind of Midwestern genotype here in Kansas City. Everyone, for the most part, is pretty friendly. There's a humility about our daily interactions, a desire to serve and support others, and I personally see less of that in St. Louis. Also, I think the cities feel quite different. Kansas City is it is, you know, like I mentioned, the green spaces and the cultural touch points in the city planning. You know, a lot of wonderful things have been going on in Kansas City of the last few years. You probably are aware that our football team has been winning a fair amount of Super Bowls.
Yeah,
We just hosted the NFL draft here. Kansas City was the smallest city in the country selected to be host city for the 2026 World Cup. We're in the midst of building a streetcar that goes all the way from downtown Kansas City to middle south neighborhoods like Brookside and the UMKC area. So that's a central transit route. We typically haven't had really incredible public transit offerings for folks, so that's really opening up the city in great ways. Um, like St. Louis, we struggle mightily with crime. And that's become an increasingly more focused issue. I mean, that is something that growing up in Kansas City, and I grew up in the city, so I'm sort of used to the feeling of, you know, always sort of having to be on guard and pay attention to your surroundings and you know, just be vigilant. uh, there's unfortunately a huge amount of crime, particularly in the central city, and specifically gun violence and homicides. So that's a troubling trend that has been exacerbated through COVID and consistently rising. We struggle with that, as does St. Louis. So there are some ways in which we're very similar. We're sort of two blue cities in the midst of a very red state, and the state government in Missouri is quite Republican. And I'm not sure exactly when that happened. We used to be Missouri considered more of a purple state, but that's become less and less the case. So you do
it's the home
have.
of Truman, right? I mean, Harry Truman is from Missouri.
Exactly right. He's from Independence, Missouri, which
Yeah,
is right here in the Kansas City metropolitan area. So, in fact, the Truman Library has just recently undergone a significant renovation and reopened its doors. Yeah, but those are some of the ways in which we are alike and different from our friends in St. Louis.
Okay. And what brought you back to Missouri when you were living in Florida?
I missed it. I missed it so much. I don't know if it's just the Midwestern girl in me. First of all, down in Florida, especially in the area where we were, which was near Fort Myers, my mother lived there at the time. It was, that's a place for snowbirds and for people who are retired. And outside of that, there's a lot of strip malls, a lot of sort of new build neighborhoods. There's a few options in terms of like a dinner theater, but there's not a lot in terms of cultural offerings. So that was one of the things I missed the most. And being in a more urban environment with access to the organizations and institutions. We also have a very thriving nonprofit community in Kansas City. So, hundreds of nonprofits doing work on any number of social and societal issues. So, I just really had a desire to come back and contribute to the community that I was raised in. Um, I was reading an interesting book actually by a young author who we recently had a chance to interview. His name's Ryan Bernstein, and he's been promoting his book, which is in many ways, I think, similar to some of the work that you're doing, Michael, with this American Tributaries podcast. He received a grant from Oxford while studying there creative writing to travel all 50 states and talk to Americans and wrote a book about it. And he attended
What was the name
Northwestern
of the
University.
book?
I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
called
yeah.
the 50 state. It's called 50 States of Mind. In fact, do I have it over here? 50 States of Mind. There's a subtitle, and I can't remember all of it, but talking about how Americans are not as divided as we may seem, and that the effort to engage in meaningful conversation in and of itself can be the thing that addresses that. And Bernstein grew up in Rockford, Illinois, so in the Rust Belt. He went to Northwestern to study creative writing, went on to Oxford to receive his master's in creative writing, and talked about this trend that he'd observed. And certainly he's not the only one, but I thought he wrote quite eloquently about it in his book, about how, most graduates of elite and high level schools just naturally will relocate to the major coastal cities because that's where the good jobs are and that's where the quality of life that they desire is. And that sort of progression, that migration away from places like Rockford, Illinois, or Kansas City, Missouri, have resulted in many ways in some of the divisions that we see because folks who have, um, you know, uh, relegated cities in the Midwest to flyover country don't really have as much consideration for the values, the concerns, the quality of life, the rights, the responsibilities, the opportunities that exist for folks in those cities. And I'm a graduate of University of Missouri, Kansas City. It's by no means an elite school, so I was, relatively immune to the pressures of like, oh, I've got to make my life in New York or Los Angeles. I've had through my career many opportunities to visit and spend time in the great cities of our nation, and I love and appreciate them for all they have to offer. I'm incredibly proud and humbled to have the opportunity in my own life to live and thrive here in Kansas City and to contribute my professional working hours to making this community that raised me a better place. And that's really important to me. So as a value, that's something that I keep top of mind. And it's one of the things that keeps me here in Kansas City, which I really love.
Yeah. You've touched upon a few things that like I guess for me my journey to doing this now is partly started with like kind of writing and trying to like make sense of what was happening in 2020 and what had been going on in my mind because I was I think a lot more I guess I don't know, say angry, confused, whatever it was, but I was a lot more wired. And one of the things I postulate to like fellow New Yorkers is that I think the way I see New York, and one thing is I think we all live in bubbles. So everybody lives in a bubble. So it's not so New York doesn't have a monopoly on this. Kansas City doesn't have a monopoly. Nobody does. New York is just a bigger bubble because it's got 8 million people. So I think that New York can kind of deceive you into thinking you know more about things than you do because it's still a bubble. Like there's 8 million people here, which is a lot, but it's still a bubble. Most people don't live like New York City. Like even Chicago is not like New York City. So you have to I think have the humility to realize that it's still different. But I think the other thing is that because there is so much that happens here, and I remember thinking this like with the 2016 election, like thinking like, how is it that so many people from you come if you're in New York, you can meet people from every state. Like one of my closest friends is from Manhattan, Kansas, and he always like playing that joke. I'm from Manhattan, Kansas, but I was like, how is we have people from everywhere, but yet we're so not aligned with what's going on in the rest of the country. Why is that? And what I started thinking, and I've thrown this out to people, so it's more like a working hypothesis, is that New York attracts a lot of people who were maybe the misfits of their towns or who just didn't or wanted maybe more than what their town was over. They were bored by it or whatever it was and they wanted something more, right? So you come to New York where there's 8 million people and there's just a lot more stuff coming at you. So I think that what you end up being the people that end up being attracted to the New Yorks or the LAs or others are people that in some respect maybe harbor a little bit of resentment towards their hometowns, and I call it like judginess. And I don't think it's not limited to just somebody in New York versus Kansas City. It could be somebody who lives in New York and like myself, who grew up in the suburbs of Long Island, and for a while you might look back like, God, like the suburbs are so boring compared to here. So I think that there's an it's almost a natural thing to happen, and it's okay to think that you like where you live, but I think that it helps to tamp down that judginess. Like it's okay to like where you live. It's great to like. You should like where you live. I think it's just a matter of tamping down a little bit because I realize that notion of flyover country is something that people they don't fly to Kansas City for vacation routinely. They'll go to LA, they'll go to Hawaii, they'll go to San Francisco. They don't go to Kansas City, and I never did that either. And I mean, maybe there's something that Kansas City could, if maybe Kansas City doesn't want to attract people from outside to Kansas City, so if it's a two-way street. But there's certainly no active curiosity from a lot of people to go visit all that land between East Coast and West Coast. And I plead as guilty as that to anything. But as I've tried to go down this rabbit hole, the more I'm just like, oh yeah, like every place has got something interesting. And if you're really a true traveler, you should be able to be curious and be excited about almost in every area, not just the typical ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And that all being said, it's it's not as if Kansas City or any other Midwestern city has to be everything to everyone. We are what we are. We've got some great things. So if you're interested in, football and barbecue and soccer, we're a really progressive city as it relates to soccer. In fact, building a new field for the KC Current, which is the women's soccer team here. So sports, the arts, and but we don't have mountains. We don't, and we've got a few lakes around, we
Mhm.
don't have the ocean, but, yeah, I think that's the whole thing about being able to better connect with one another is really starting with a level of curiosity about how others live and what their experiences are. And some of us are naturally curious, and we can lean into that to understand and experience places in richer ways than we would be able to if we didn't go into it with sort of open hearts, open minds. And some people just really aren't that. And cultivating that curiosity, I think, is a wonderful thing for just building human connection, whether or not you want to travel to different locations. But I think part of the purpose here of your podcast, Michael, which I really applaud the efforts that you're making to connect with people around the country. I think part of the purpose of that, if I understand correctly, is just to foster more connections and more relationships, and to tap into that curiosity to learn more about how others live, experience, and perceive the world. So I do believe that relationships are the currency of our lives, and it's not the stuff, it's not the bank account balance, it's not, in every aspect, all the experiences that have accumulated to something that we can look back on with pride, but it's the interactions that we have with others. So finding ways, and quite honestly too, I think there's something in that that's probably the recipe to achieving the mission of American Public Square, where I work, which is to improve and enhance the quality of public discourse in our communities for the better of everyone. I think there's something in that recipe of curiosity, of kindness, and of the suspension of contempt too. Because I thought you hit on something important, and I could totally see that. That's an interesting insight, one that really had not occurred to me. About folks who move to New York, maybe have something that they wish to leave behind that wasn't fulfilling or meaningful to them where they were, or they want more, they want something different. They may be harboring some kind of resentment. I certainly don't think that's true for everyone, but I think that is an interesting insight to what drives some people to leave the place of their birth or their hometown in search of something different, something better in a bigger city. Um,
And I think just like to leave your hometown requires a certain level of emotional drive. Like I think if you're pretty comfortable, why would you leave? Of course, there has to be some extra thrust, and whether it's like ambition or if it's alienation. So I think it's like a two-way thing. I think so I think it's those emotions. People come here and they might actually be in a more heightened emotional state, and it's a negative emotional state because for some reason they never connected with their community, so they come here and then they're just like people in Missouri are just so like whatever. And I know that's not the case, but I think it's that vibe that kind of then perpetuates. And it's not necessarily even just blaming them, and certainly not everybody's like that. But I think like macro wise, I think that I've never heard a fellow New Yorker say that that was a wrong opinion. I'm sure it's not totally right, but I don't think it's wrong.
yeah, no, that's fascinating to me. And we talked a bit, when we were, on the telephone prior to this conversation about a book by a man by the name of Arthur Brooks, and he wrote a book called "Love Your Enemies." He's currently at Harvard Kennedy School, and he talks about sort of the culture of contempt, and that one of the seeds of our discontent today, one of the problems with being able to meaningfully connect with others, is this feeling of contempt. And that's bad for us, it's bad for others, it's what keeps us from being able to truly listen, and understand the perspectives of people with whom we do not agree. So that emotion or that tone of contempt is something that I think we can all kind of serve ourselves and society well by recognizing that, because we all certainly feel it for different things, and in different it surfaces in different ways in our lives. But that's a marker, I think, and something that we should pay attention to when we feel that, because it's it's a it's a difficult place from which to start if your intention is ever to meaningfully connect with others. Um, and as a society, we just sort of have a hard time right now with the notion that someone who disagrees with you about, the topic of the day, can still be a good person. They could still be worth talking to. Just because there's not alignment on, this particular value or political belief doesn't mean you can't have a friendship or much less even a conversation with the person. But I think, in the Trump era, I think I really saw it happening starting in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected. And it had been, bubbling, I think, before then, without question, because it's not just like, something happens and everything changes, but that really was a catalyzing factor, I think, for people saying, you know what, look, I can't anymore. I refuse to talk to so and so who believes this about this, because that belief is abominable. It's it's an embarrassment. It's a travesty. It's just wrong headed. Um, we've got to get past that. This is the great experiment. And you're right. There's so many kinds of diversity in the country. Not only are we all spread apart and living in different types of communities and lifestyles with different interests and cultural backgrounds and religious faiths and beliefs and traditions. But we it's up to us to make that work.
Yeah.
It's not someone else's job to make it work. It's ours.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the one of the I guess other another grounding thing I refer to is just kind of thinking about. I think, and I'm not going to blame technology, but I'm going to blame that I guess we have to adapt to a new reality, which is we can observe everybody, right? And this idea that there's criticism is always that there's everybody's got an opinion, right? So it's not necessarily even like, oh, we can't disagree. We've gone astray or awry or something. If I filmed a video of me screwing in a light bulb, and I posted that and got a lot of people to watch that, you'd probably get thousands of people who are criticizing any number of different things that I was doing. I live in a building with 70 other Brooklynites. I'm sure that if people watched each other, they would be like, "Oh my god, like I can't believe you do that with your kids," or "Why do you feed your kids that way?" or "Why do you take shower?" Like, there's so many things. So I think this idea that we've got to impose our thoughts or there's a one singular right way is something we have to kind of get rid of. And I think to me that's why I've kind of settled on feeling like the way out I see is more about adhering to values of it's four: curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. Because with those four we can coexist. I mean, it really doesn't make a difference what you believe, as long as we're both practicing those. You can do you and I can do me. And I know it seems simplistic, but there's do we want a complicated solution? No. Like, why would you want a complicated solution? Just if you practice those, we can all get along.
Yeah. I love those four words. That I think you nailed it with those. And if I had to, rank them, to me, the top of the list needs to be humility. We've lost that as a society, where we just feel like, okay, the opinions in my head are the opinions, and I'm going to go out into the world sort of with this notion that, like, either you're with me or you're against me. Either you're right or you're wrong. And it's like, well, hey, listen, just because that's the way you feel about something doesn't mean, or the way that you think about it doesn't mean that it's entirely correct. And if you go into conversations or just out into the world without the understanding, without the fundamental framing on your own, ignorance and vulnerability in the world, then everything is lost. And so to me, humility is right at the very top of the list. And it's because I see so little of that out there, because I think humility also um, lends itself then to respect and care and compassion for others, and curiosity too, because you don't think you already have all the answers. So when I've sort of done some mental philosophical sort of explorations on what's at the heart of what's dividing Americans today, or what's making us feel divided, because I think, again, part of this is just the way that we feel and the stimulus that we receive. It's not actually the reality of how it is. And when you engage in conversations with one another, like you and I are doing today, 1,100 miles to the east of me in a totally different time and place, you realize there are, ultimately a lot more things that connect us. We are, all humans in this, human experience. And you can identify, recognize, embrace, and celebrate those connections, when you're not focused on sort of finger pointing, holding people in contempt who think differently than you, and blaming them for all the ills of society.
Yeah, and to me, the notion of humility, as you're talking about it, I think makes even more sense when you think about the fact that you're not even you shouldn't be the same person today that you were tomorrow. So if you can't be humble with regard to even yourself, you're not allowing yourself any evolution either. Like, because
Totally.
you're a different person. Like, I'm a different person than I was 10 years ago, and if I can't deal with other people who think differently, then I can't even deal with myself. Like, there's almost like it becomes not even like self-loathing, almost becomes like it has to happen because you can't accept people who think differently, and that includes
Right.
yourself. So it's but we should. I know that you have a hard stop in about like 20 minutes or so, but we should talk more about like American Public Square. So like what have you guys been doing, and what's the history of the organization?
Yeah, so American Public Square was founded by Ambassador Alan Katz in 2014 in Kansas City. Alan was appointed the ambassadorship to Portugal by Barack Obama, and when he returned to the States following that appointment in 2013, he was recruited to University of Missouri, Kansas City by then Chancellor Leo Morton, who's a trusted advocate and friend of the organization, to teach law at UMKC. And part of Alan's, Ambassador Katz's stipulation was, I'd really like to be able to start this organization that I've been thinking about. He had and lived and worked in Tallahassee, Florida prior to his appointment, and with a woman by the name of Liz Joyner, founded an organization that's still in operation today called the Village Square. And they do the same type of thing that American Public Square does in Kansas City. So we've now been in operation here in Kansas City since 2014. Next year will be our 10-year anniversary. The organization was founded with the idea that we are having an increasingly difficult time having respectful and fact-based conversations about the most divisive issues of our day. And Alan wanted to create a nonprofit organization that was solely focused on addressing that. So that's exactly what we do. We produce public programming. Most of the time it's in Kansas City. We're not opposed to or in any way geographically limited to the Kansas City area, but a lot of what we do is community engagement, and it's very much focused on our local residents and voices, and providing space for them to engage in the issues that matter to them in a way that feels curious and humble and respectful and compassionate, all those things that you talk about. So we've been doing public programming here in Kansas City. Just this year alone, we've tackled issues like cancel culture. We've got a program coming up next week on reparations. We have a civics education initiative that takes a classroom-based curriculum into area high schools in the fall semester, and brings student ambassadors from all of those area high schools, which are geographically disparate all over the metro area. And we bring those students together to identify a topic of their own choosing, and American Public Square entirely supports the students in producing an American Public Square style program. So they just completed their culminating program of the year in April on the topic of abortion, which was student selected and obviously very divisive. So we tackle all those most what sometimes are referred to as wicked issues that don't have just one solution. There are myriad perspectives on them. It's not just two sides, it's, multiple sides. And it's really important to us to create space where all sides can be expressed and explored and respectfully articulated. So we have a number of sort of what we call our civility toolkit, some parameters that we put in place in these public programs. Oftentimes the conversations are moderated panel conversations. So the moderator is sort of helping to keep us on track. We produce a very extensive fact sheet that goes along with the subject matter. So, for example, we've got a very extensive digital fact sheet that's a companion guide to the program that's coming up next week in Kansas City on the topic of reparations. We have live fact checkers at our events. We ask audiences, to not applaud or cheer during the program, so as there's no sort of interest from panelists in sort of throwing some red meat out there and getting a
Yeah.
big response. So we've got some things in place that help us to really ensure that those conversations can take place in a respectful and fact-based way. We are partnered with Kansas City PBS, and several of our programs are aired on the public television station here in Kansas City as well. We're also a part, and I wanted to talk. I don't want to miss the opportunity to share a little bit about something that's happening in Kansas City that's very exciting, that American Public Square is a part of, which is the Kansas City Media Collective, the KC Media Collective. This is a group of nonprofit journalism organizations, journalism and journalism adjacent, I should say, because American Public Square, technically, we're not a newsroom, we're not a journalism organization. We do more of the community engagement work. But these organizations have come together to form a collective entity that has the purpose of increasing trust in local journalism among residents and readers and listeners, enhancing the sustainability of local journalism, which has been decimated over the last many decades of disinvestment and consolidation, and ensuring that people have access to the news, and that the news is covering stories that people care about and people want to see. So the work that we've done with the KC Media Collective has been really inspiring as well. We had the opportunity to participate in the Poynter Institute's Table Stakes program. So we're a part of that this year, which is sort of a innovation on-ramp for organizations to sort of adapt to the changing media landscape. So we are the first collective of its kind to participate in that program, and that's been really inspiring and interesting, and sort of an adventure all in and of itself. So American Public Square is also proudly a member of the KC Media Collective, and we do joint programs. Other members include KCPBS, KCUR, which is a local NPR affiliate. There's a news-based startup, the KC Beacon, and a couple other smaller business-focused nonprofits that are a part of that group at the time, at present.
That sounds great, and I think I've heard about this decimation of like local journalism from other people, and I feel like that's almost one of the biggest problems that leads to a lot of the polarization and the political angst. And my theory is that without that local journalism, the only reporting we get is like these national issues, and these are national issues. And like to me, it's like you see New Yorkers who get more upset about the politics in Texas and Florida than they do about the politics in New York. and I'm sure that's everywhere, because all we're seeing is the news feeds from Fox News, News Nation, MSNBC, CNN, and they're not reporting on the local things that actually more implicate your life. Like, it should matter more to me that there's a bunch of storefronts on the local like street which have been closed down for a while, more than what's happening in the politics in Texas or whatever. And not that I shouldn't care about it, but in terms of prioritizing, I feel like our priorities have gotten out of whack, to where we're putting all of our energy and our emotion and our finances into issues that are far away, that we don't understand. But the other part of it is, I think there's also there's a powerlessness, because now all of a sudden you can't actually do anything. You don't understand what's happening in Texas, and you don't live there, and there's just a politician saying, I'll do this, and then nothing happens. Because I mean, I think the other part of what, to my perception, is that the country's only getting bigger and bigger and more complicated. And anybody who works in the working world, and I'm sure even like for yourself, it's hard to get projects done on your scale. And what we do is, like, we're upset about this. The federal government needs to fix it. And I mean, I'm a, I've always voted Democrat, but I feel like there is this notion that we just have to have the government fix it, whether it's federal or state or local. And really, sometimes, like, you've got to fix it yourself. Like, I think there's got to be more embracing of our own responsibility. And I think we all have to do that. And again, it's not to say that government isn't supposed to fix things, but that it's not enough to just say the government's got to fix it. You also have to think about, what can I do and what do I need to give up to do something. And I think that's the problem, is that nobody wants to give anything up. We want the politicians to fix it, but don't burden me and don't blame me. It's not my fault and it's not my burden. Just make it happen. And it's hard enough to do it when you're actually invested, when you're vested in it. It's even harder when you just don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like Robert Putnam says in Bowling Alone, we sort of outsourced democracy, really.
Yes.
We said, let the politicians deal with it. I'm really not going to pay much attention.
Yeah.
And then the politicians will do what they will, which,
Right.
we could have a whole podcast talking about, what the politicians do. And I know that's not what we're going to be doing. But there's, a lot missing from that equation, and democracy, the strength of our democracy is really rooted in this notion of an informed and engaged citizenry. And that's what the Casey Media Collective is all about, making sure
Yeah.
that people have the resources and access that they need to be informed. And American Public Square has always been focused on an engaged and educated populace, and we create the opportunities for people to lean into a topic and educate themselves. And if I just wanted to, like, touch my finger to my nose when you said the thing about responsibility, because that's the thing. We're off kilter a little bit because people are really focused on their rights. They want to talk about what their rights are. But the other side of the rights coin is responsibility, and we all have it. And until we're willing to exercise that responsibility, then we can't really meaningfully address the issues that are happening. And you're absolutely right. It's at the local level. It's in the municipal government. It's on the committees. There's a wonderful group in Kansas City called United We, which is focused on. They've got a national effort called the Appointments Project, which is focused on getting women appointed to commissions and committees and seats at the table where important decisions are being made. So it's not the sexy, glamorous, I'm going to run for president of the United States, but it's, no, I'm going to attend this city council meeting, and I'm going to be knowledgeable and aware of what's taking place in my own city, and I'm going to take some responsibility for that personally. And so, that the fabric of the nonprofit community here, that American Public Square is engaged in, we're swimming in those waters. That's a really important part of what we do, is helping people to have the access to the information they need, and also giving them a way to step forward and engage in the community.
Yeah, and the to but as I was thinking about this, I'm thinking about teachers, and I think that my perception is that, like, teachers are because there's email connections, right? Teachers can be bombarded by the parents of of the kids in their school, so it's great to have that connectivity, but what I picture happening on that micro scale, which I think then just blows up to every other level, is it's the loudest parent who's going to get the most attention, right? Because it's the one that who's either has the free time, or maybe a problem with, they're the problem parent, they're the loudest parent. Like, whereas I think, like, if you think, if you're a teacher, like, you have so many things you're trying to juggle in the school, and when you'd like to think that having open access is a good thing, but actually it could be very distracting, because now all of a sudden you've got this one loud parent who's, like, rallying the other parents to focus on an issue that's not that relevant, but they've made it relevant, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I picture like as you go up, if you're trying to talk about like the enticing people into local government or any other level of government, I think there's something there that's also very discouraging that we'd have to kind of fix, to be like, how do you, because like in New York City, like you have those, there's random, like, usually it's somebody who's like somebody who's like unhoused, or look, they've had some kind of drug problem, but they talk and yell and shout and you ignore them because there's nothing else to do. And I feel like what we've done now is we actually give them the microphone, and then we give them a louder microphone. And like, how do you keep people as a part of a society but still push them aside enough to kind of get things done and let the quiet majority dictate things? You know what I mean? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what happens on a micro level, and it happens on the big level, is that there are mature people and thoughtful people. Some of them either just don't care, they don't have the time, or they just trust you're going to make the right decision. But we're always guided by that loudest voice.
Yeah. That reminds me of something that'd probably be a great kind of thing, at least from my comments to end on, but a book by Susan King called Quiet. And she talks about, when you were talking about people moving to New York, I was kind of thinking about this because, there was a cultural shift from, that took place sort of during industrialization, during the move to major urban centers, from what was considered kind of the cult of character, meaning you knew everyone in your neighborhood. They knew you. They knew your history. They knew whether your word was good or not. They knew whether your values were in alignment with theirs or not. It's sort of this cult of character, at which we transitioned from that, away from that, into this thing that's focused on sort of the cult of personality. So, because we're all crammed in there together, we know each other a little bit less better. Even in places like Kansas City, which many probably think of as a cow town, it's still, got urban effects, right?
Yeah.
People know each other less. So therefore, we have this tendency to listen to the loudest voices, the first person to speak, the person who speaks with the most confidence. And we have this kind of cultural deference to people who are extroverts, who are good at, let's say, speaking extemporaneously, right? We say, oh, these people, they know what they're talking about, I'm going to follow them. When in reality, there are people who are sitting back thoughtfully, who don't have the kind of confidence or even just personality that would say, I'm going to be the loudest voice in the room, I'm going to be
Yeah.
the fastest voice in the room, I'm going to be the one who's talking the most. That hold within themselves and their intellect the ability to solve some of these challenging issues, but we won't listen to them because the culture says no, it's the person who talks louder that we got to pay attention to. So I say, how do we go back to finding the treasure and the value in what the quiet folks are thinking and doing, and the introverts among us? There might be something in that to continue to explore.
Yeah. One of the things, cliches I've heard about, like, people in business meetings is sometimes the best ideas come from that quiet person who hasn't said anything except for one thing. And we're losing all those insights because they don't have enough followers. They have 100 followers and they gave a great idea, but because they haven't been loud for the last 2 years and they don't have 5,000 followers, nobody hears it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's one of the big challenges. And I think, like, I'd love to be able to dive more into talking about all the, like, the various issues, but I just think, to me, it's like we need to kind of understand this, the bigger setting, and address those. And I think it's so fascinating. I wish we could talk more, but I know you've got to get going. But can I ask, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Gosh, well, conversations like this one, the fact that there are people, and you're not alone, Michael. You're doing a great thing here. But through, the work that I do, I have the opportunity to connect with people across the country and across the world who are doing similar work. We had the opportunity to interview Robert Putnam and Shaylin Romney Garrett, who wrote a book called The Upswing. Their message about, the moral duty that each of us have to be engaged members of society was really uplifting to me. My conversation with Ryan Bernstein, who wrote 50 States of Mind, the power of conversation, and humility and connection. Just having an opportunity to sit with you today and informally, in a really unstructured and unscripted way, just talk through some of the things that we're each observing and perceiving in our own lines of work is really heartening to me. I'd love to see that work continue. I know there are national and local movements afoot to build better bridges amongst and between Americans. And at the end of the day, I think those things truly give me hope that we have enough motivated people who are practicing respect, compassion, curiosity, and humility. And if we can kind of hone in on those values and embrace them in our interactions with one another, I think we can come out okay.
Yeah. Thank you. That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I wish you the best of luck in your mission and everything that you're doing out there.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me
Yeah.
today.
Thank you. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Take care, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you.